Perfect.
Welcome back to Life of Birch. This is Birch, and today we have a quick video for you that's actually one of the most requested videos I've gotten since I picked up my Rebel 1100, and that is a comparison of the 500 and the 1100. We're not going to talk about, the power or capabilities or anything like that. We're just going to focus on strictly a walk around to show the differences and similarities in size and exterior, all that kind of good stuff. I will talk about the performance of the bikes and how they ride as a comparison in another video, but for today we're just going to talk about how they look. So first, we'll do a walk around of both of the bikes and show you the similarities and the differences, and then I'm actually going to hop on both bikes. You can see me sit on them and kind of see how I fit on each of the bikes. Now, before we get started, if you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button. If you found this video, you're obviously interested in either the Rebel 500 or the Rebel 1100. I already have tons of content with my 500, and I got tons more to come on my 1100. I've been working super hard to keep up with my regular work schedule and start putting out 2 videos a week as opposed to 1 video. So if you go ahead and subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment, it'll show me that all my hard work is paying off. All right, now let's jump straight into it. All right, so you can see that from the side profile, the bikes are really similar sizes. I don't know the exact spec, but I want to say the Rebel 1100 is only 2 inches longer than the 500. But if I didn't know that, I probably wouldn't be able to tell by just looking at them. For me, where the size difference really kicks in is when you look at it from the back. And this is a good time to mention that obviously my 500 is not stock by any means, whereas the 1100 is bone stock. So obviously for a normal 500, you're not going to have the width of the frame sliders and the engine guards, and you're also just going to have a regular single seat, kind of like my 1100 does. But as you look at the 500 from the back, you can see that it's very narrow. The tank, the foot position, the rear fender, and then you move over to the 1100, and that's where you can really see the size difference. Not only is the tank considerably wider than the 500, but also the rear fender is considerably wider to kind of follow the lines of the tank. And then you can also see that the footing position is considerably wider than the 500 as well. And you would think that it was just because of the engine sticking out further, but you can actually see that the little foot controls stick out further than the engine does, and that's kind of what gives it the width. Now with that said, I kind of like it because it keeps your legs from bumping into the engine sticking out on the side, whereas with the 500, one of the complaints that people have is you can see right here the engine sticks out, but your foot peg is right there, so your leg kind of presses up against that while you're riding. You don't really get that with the 1100 though. And now as we're looking at the bike from the back, another key difference is going to be the suspension. You can see with the 1100 it has the piggyback shock, whereas on the 500 it has just the regular shock. And then it's also interesting because they're almost like upside down, like the cartridge or whatever you call it is on the bottom on the 500, whereas it's on the top with the 1100. The preload adjustability is at the top on the 1100, and the preload adjustability is at the bottom on the 500. And then continuing with some of the differences on the rear, on the 500 you have the Honda Rebel sticker here, whereas on the 1100 it's actually indented here as part of the fender. So that's kind of a nice fit and finish upgrade for the 1100. And it's also worth noting that we have the LED lights on the 1100, whereas this is kind of the first generation or whatever of the 500, so it still has the big regular lights. If you were comparing a 2021 versus a 2021, they would both have the LED lights, and I believe they're the same exact ones, except the 1100 has the clear lens and the 500 has a red lens. All right, so then we'll follow it up to the seat. Now obviously this is a stock seat on the 1100, whereas that is an aftermarket seat, but it's still worth noting that the seat on the 1100, all you have to do is stick the key in here, push it in and turn, and you have a quick release for the seat. It pops right up and it has storage underneath, whereas the 500, if you were to look through here on the 500, has 2 Allen keys that you need to undo here in order to pop it off. So it's definitely a lot easier to get the seat off on the 1100, and the 500 does not have any storage under the seat like the 1100 does. All right, so now we'll follow it up here, and you can see the mirrors are, I'm pretty sure, the same. If they're not the same, they sure look the same, but the key difference here is just kind of the setup on the bars. Obviously the 1100 has a lot more tech than the 500 does, so on the 1100 you're going to have where you can select all your riding riding modes. You can switch the different modes to change what shows on your screen. And then of course it's also going to have the cruise control standard right there. When you come over to the 500, you're just going to have, you know, the basics, starting the bike and, you know, the high beams. You're not going to have quite as much tech on the bars laid out for you. And then there's also going to be a pretty big difference in what you see on the screen. Again, this is the 2017 model, whereas you're going to have a different display on the 2020 and above. But you can see that this display is pretty basic, just shows you the miles per hour, your miles, your fuel, and the time. Whereas if you come over to the 1100, obviously that screen's going to show a lot more because of all the tech that this bike has. So you start it up and you can see you have your gear indicator, you have all the different modes, you can switch what mileage shows, you have air temperature, you have a tachometer, you have all your gauges over here showing ABS, traction control. So obviously you get a lot more on that display than you do on the 500 display. And again, you know what, now that the bikes are on, I'll kind of compare the front. Again, this is the 2017, so it does not have the LEDs. You have the halogen bulb, and I have the yellow headlight cover on that. But then you come over here, and the LED just looks awesome. Now, the difference with this, as far as I know, this is a different headlight than the 500 has. I don't believe that the 500 has kind of the lights around the side right there, so I think that looks pretty sick. I could be wrong, but I haven't seen that or noticed that on the 500. All right, now let's go ahead and turn it off so that I don't forget and drain the battery. And then we'll come back around the front to kind of one of the fit and finish things that I was talking about. So you'll notice on the 1100, it has kind of like a cloth wire loom around all of these wires. So it's kind of like a nice touch there. But if you come over to the 500, all of the wires are just kind of like rubber coated, which, you know, serves its purpose, but doesn't really look quite as nice as all of this kind of, I don't know if wire loom's the right word, but looks really nice. You still have some of the regular rubber around like these lines, but the rest is kind of that nice look there. Now with that said, however, I did notice that with the 1100, it kind of just feels like they have a bunch of like wires that they didn't have anything to do with and they just stuffed them there. You can kind of see the connector right there peeking out, and they did try to remedy that because you can see that this cover is considerably taller and longer than the cover on the 500. Not quite as much to hide on the 500, so I guess they kind of made that one longer to fit everything they needed to hide for all of the tech. But it's also nice because it could just be in my head, but I feel like this kind of helps deflect some of the wind better than that does. Obviously not by much, but. And then as you look over here, you'll see that you have the adjustable brake lever for the 1100, whereas stock on the 500, it's not adjustable. I did add adjustable levers, so you have adjustability on both, but from the factory, they're not adjustable, whereas over here, you have adjustability on the brake lever, although not the clutch lever. And then style-wise, you see the blacked out 43 millimeter forks on the 1100, whereas on the 500, you have the chrome 41 millimeter forks, and then you'll also notice a difference in the size of the brakes. I don't know the exact size difference, but you can see that this rotor is considerably smaller, whereas the rotor on the 1100 is not only bigger, but it's a different design. I don't want to misquote it, but I believe they're called floating rotors, so you can see that this kind of allows for some movement there, whereas the other one is just solid. So it's nice to see the size difference on that, because obviously with all the added power, you're going to need more stopping power, and that was one of the things that people were kind of worried about, is the fact that it didn't have the dual rotors. And without getting into too much talk about the performance, I've noticed that the stopping power on this bike is more than adequate. And now looking at it from the front, I'm not sure if there's actually a difference in the height of the front of the bikes, but it almost looks like the 1100's handlebars and the whole front end just kind of sit up higher than the 500's does. I could be making that up. It might be in my head because I haven't really looked at the specs per se, but it does seem that those handlebars sit up higher than this does. Now, another kind of fit and finish note on the two bikes is the foot pegs. So this one you can see is much wider this way and has kind of like the claws. It did have a rubber insert, but I took it out for kind of like the dirt bike look, but it has the teeth on that and on that, whereas you come over to the 1100 and this one is much more smooth. It doesn't have anything you can remove to make it grip more. It's a little bit slipperier, and then it has this kind of textured foot peg, whereas the other one has like the spikes on it. And now obviously this is an aftermarket shorty exhaust on this bike, whereas that's the stock exhaust on that bike. But I will say that if the stock muffler were on this, it would look very similar. All right, and the last glaring difference that you're going to notice is the size of the front wheel and front tire. So you have an 18-inch front on the 1100 and you have a 16-inch front on the 500. You can see that the 500 has a much more kind of bulbous, if that's the right word, front tire, whereas on the 1100 you don't get kind of that same look. It looks more narrow and you have the big front wheel. So that's nice not only for looks but also for performance. I feel like, actually, you know what, I won't even get into those details. You have to wait for the comparison video I put out for the performance, but I will say that the tire does make a difference. All right, and I think that just about covers all of the similarities and differences. I'll do a quick little walk around so you can get one last look of the two bikes next to each other. And then in just a second here, I'll hop on both bikes and kind of give you guys a look at my seating position and size on both of the bikes comparatively. Leave a comment. Do you think I'm going to look massively smaller on the 1100 and look like I have a bunch of room, or is it going to look very similar? All right, let's hop on them. First, we'll throw a leg over the 500. It's worth noting I'm about 5'10", 5'11" on a good day. I have a 32-inch inseam, pretty lanky as you can tell. And it's also worth noting that, again, this is not the stock seat. So I found that when I installed this seat, it did sit me up a little bit higher and it allowed me to sit a little bit further back if I needed to, because I can kind of slide since it's the single seat. So it's not exactly the same seating position as the stock seat. However, it's not that big of a difference. All right, so you can see it's nice and relaxed. I don't have to reach too far to get to the handlebars. It's a pretty comfortable neutral position. And if I go ahead and put my foot up there, you can see it's not super cramped. My leg does come up a little higher than some people would like. Some people like kind of the forward controls or whatever. Me personally, I like kind of a more sporty, maybe aggressive stance, so I don't actually mind it. But you can see my legs probably at like a right angle or something like that, not super bent. And then, you know, the brake pedal's right there. You got plenty of room to kind of move your foot to the side if you need to, if you're just cruising. And it does have kind of those spikes, those grips that hold your foot on, like I was talking about. Now, again, like I said, it doesn't normally have just like a rubber insert here, but I took that out to kind of get more grip out of it, and I kind of like the way that that is. It also allows my foot to sit a little bit lower and gave me a little bit extra space, I think. Could be in my head, but sounds right. And then the last thing worth noting is, like I said, it does have this little cover here that, because your foot sits so far in on this peg, it does kind of, your leg will bump it sometimes. Honestly, it's not that bothersome, and I might not have noticed it if I hadn't read about it online before I got the bike. All right, so that's the seating position on the 500. We'll roll it out of the way and show you what I look like sitting on the 1100. All right, hopefully my editing magic just worked and it looked like I switched from the 500 to the 1100 seamlessly, but I wouldn't bet my money on it. All right, so on the 1100, you can see the seating position is pretty similar, although it feels almost like I'm sitting up slightly higher. I forget the seat height difference. I think it's about an inch, so nothing drastic, but you can definitely tell that I'm sitting up slightly higher. The seat definitely has more area and a little bit more cush to it than the stock seat on the 500 did. I remember that for sure. That's why I swapped that seat out so quickly. And while this seat isn't the best, it definitely is more comfortable than the 500s. You can see that my arm position is pretty similar. I have about the same reach, although it definitely feels as if the bars are wider than the 500s. That's one of the first things I noticed when I got on it. Not drastically wider, but you can tell it's definitely a little bit wider, but it almost helps you have more control over the bike, so I don't mind that. Again, it could be all in my head, but it feels like the bars sit up slightly higher, which I like because I know lots of people with the 500 end up putting little bar risers on or whatever, so I like it. It's still like a very neutral seating position. I'm not leaned too far forward. I don't have the bars too close to me, so I find it to be super comfortable. And then I'll go ahead and throw my leg up there. You can see that it's pretty similar to the 500. My leg does sit out a little bit further, like I mentioned, because of this little thing right here, but that's not really a big concern. Obviously, the bike is expected to be a little bit wider than the 500. So you can see my leg does come up a little bit. Still, it's probably only about a 90-degree angle. Not an incredible amount more space than the 500 had, which might be disappointing to some people because I think they were kind of hoping that it would give them a lot more space. But again, I like kind of a more aggressive, sporty position, so I don't mind it. Like I said, I'm 5'10", about a 32-inch inseam, and my knee comes up right to where the kind of dent in the tank is right there. So that kind of works out nicely for me. I'm not sure how somebody would feel if they were like 6'3" trying to ride this bike, but I feel like, you know, 5'10", it's totally fine for me. I'm super comfortable. I went out 5.5 hours yesterday and had no complaints. 6 foot, I think you'd probably be fine. Anything above that, especially if you're super lanky, you might want to start looking into forward controls or maybe a seat kind of like that one that I was talking about that sits you up a little bit higher and a little bit further back. But then even for somebody shorter, I think it's totally fine because, like I said, I'm not not really reaching for the bars at all. So if you had shorter arms, it wouldn't be too much of a reach for you. And then just sitting on it from a weight standpoint, this bike weighs 80 pounds more, but of course most of the weight is going to be down in the engine, keeping the center of gravity low. So even though it's an 80-pound difference, me standing the two bikes up and moving them around, I really didn't feel that big of a difference. So if the 80-pound difference is kind of holding you back, I would say don't let it. You really don't feel it sitting here. As I jinx it, just knocked the bike over. That would suck. But yeah, you don't really feel the weight difference. If anything, when you're riding, it kind of helps the bike stay on course when the wind blows and you're on the highway. I said I wouldn't talk about like performance differences between the two, but I keep finding myself doing that. But yeah, so as far as the size difference, hopefully this kind of gives you guys a better look at how I fit on both of the bikes. Honestly, I'm a lot more comfortable, not a lot more comfortable, but definitely more comfortable on this bike than I was on the 500 overall. The 500 isn't uncomfortable by any means, but I definitely find myself liking this a little bit more with my legs sitting further out, a wider grip on the bars, and sitting up a little bit higher on the seat. Hopefully that gave you guys kind of an insight as to the differences between the two bikes as far as size, fit, finish. I'm sure there are things I'm forgetting, like just off the top of my head right now, I remembered that I didn't mention the fact that the front and rear fender are painted on the 1100, whereas on the 500, both of them are flat black, or with the newer models, you only get paint on the rear fender, not the front. But those are things you can tell just by looking at it. The main purpose was just kind of to let you guys see what I look like sitting on it. So hopefully that helped you guys out. If it did, make sure to leave a big thumbs up on the video. Leave a comment letting me know what your favorite part was. Every comment helps the YouTube algorithm push the video out to more people. And of course, stay tuned for more content. Right now I'm putting out a video every Sunday and every Wednesday, and I plan to keep that up as long as I possibly can. Of course, unfortunately, the 500 is going away soon, probably over the next week or two, and then I'll be left with just the 1100, but I cannot wait to get out and explore on this thing and see what it's made of. So make sure to subscribe if you haven't so that you don't miss out on that, and we will catch you on the next one. Peace.